March 15, 1994. Harrison Ford stood on Stage 7 at Paramount Studios, staring at a body bag being wheeled past craft services. Stuntman Danny Vasquez had just fallen 60 feet during what should have been a routine helicopter sequence. The studio head whispered in Ford's ear, "We can make this go away. Just say it was Danny's fault." Ford looked at Danny's 19-year-old daughter crying by the ambulance. He looked at the studio executives with their checkbooks ready. Then he said 5 words that would haunt him forever. "Danny screwed up. Not my problem." Within 6 months, Ford had vanished from Hollywood. The official story was creative differences. The real story was that Ford learned Danny's harness had been sabotaged. Someone wanted that stuntman dead, and Ford's 5 words had helped cover up murder. 30 years later, that 19-year-old girl just knocked on his cabin door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harrison Ford's hand froze on the cabin door handle. Through the frosted glass, he could make out a slight figure, dark hair pulled back, expensive camera equipment slung over her shoulder. 30 years of Wyoming winters had taught him to recognize danger in all its forms, and this woman carried it like a loaded weapon. The knock came again. 3 deliberate raps. "Mr. Ford? My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm making a documentary about forgotten Hollywood legends." Vasquez. The name hit him like a punch to the solar plexus. Ford stepped back from the door, his weathered hands trembling. Danny's little girl, the one who'd been sobbing by the ambulance while he'd stood there and lied to save his own skin. "I know you're in there," Elena called out, her voice steady despite the March wind rattling the cabin's walls. "I can see smoke from your chimney. I drove 8 hours from Denver. 5 minutes of your time, that's all I'm asking." Ford closed his eyes, remembering. Danny Vasquez had been the best in the business. Fearless, precise, never took unnecessary risks. The kind of stuntman who checked his own gear 3 times before trusting anyone else's work. There was no way Danny had screwed up. But Ford had said those 5 words anyway, sealing Danny's reputation as a careless amateur who'd gotten himself killed. The truth was so much worse. Ford had been walking back to his trailer when he'd overheard them in the rigging bay. "Make sure Vasquez's harness fails at exactly 40 feet. Any higher, and it might look suspicious." He should have warned Danny. Should have called it off. Instead, he'd convinced himself he'd misheard, that his paranoia was getting the better of him. When Danny plummeted 60 feet instead of 40, Ford knew the killers had been just as surprised as everyone else. "I have evidence, Mr. Ford." Elena's voice carried a different tone now, sharper, more dangerous, about what really happened on Stage 7, about who wanted my father dead and why. Ford's blood turned to ice. For 3 decades, he'd told himself the secret had died with Danny. The studio executives who'd orchestrated the cover-up were either dead or retired. The investigators had been paid off. The files were buried so deep that God himself couldn't dig them up. But here she was. "I know about the Meridian development deal," Elena continued. "I know my father found out about the money laundering through the stunt coordinators union. I know someone ordered his death to keep him quiet." Ford slumped against the kitchen counter. Meridian Development. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 20 years. It had been the biggest scandal Hollywood never heard about, a complex web of studio money, union kickbacks, and offshore accounts that had funneled millions to finance organized crime operations on the West Coast. Danny had stumbled onto it by accident, discovered that certain stunt coordinators were inflating crew costs and skimming the excess into Meridian accounts. He'd been naive enough to think the FBI would protect him if he came forward. The studio heads had other ideas. The official cause of death was equipment failure. Elena's voice was closer now, right against the door. "But I have the original harness, the one that somehow disappeared from evidence." Funny thing about sabotage, Mr. Ford. It leaves very specific marks when you know what to look for. Ford's workshop was filled with 30 years' worth of handcrafted furniture, each piece a meditation on the life he'd built after walking away from Hollywood. Clean lines, honest wood, no lies hidden in the joinery. He'd thought he'd found peace in this place. Thought the ghosts of Stage 7 couldn't follow him into the Wyoming mountains. He'd been wrong. I also know you tried to warn him. Elena's voice carried a note of something that might have been forgiveness. 3 times you called the stunt coordinator's office that morning. I have the phone records. You knew something was wrong. Ford straightened. She was right. He had tried to call. But the coordinator had been unreachable, probably already bought and paid for. By the time Ford had realized the scope of the conspiracy, Danny was already climbing into that harness. "What do you want?" Ford called through the door, though he already knew the answer. "Justice. For my father, and for all the others who died to protect Hollywood's dirty secrets." Elena paused. "But mostly, Mr. Ford, I want the truth. Because I think you've been carrying it like a stone in your chest for 30 years, and I think you're finally ready to put it down." Ford looked around his cabin, at the life he'd built on a foundation of silence and shame. At 82, he didn't have many years left to make things right. His hand moved toward the door lock. Outside, Elena Vasquez waited with her cameras and her evidence and her father's ghost. "Want to know if Harrison Ford opens that door? Make sure you're following this story, because tomorrow we dive deep into the conspiracy that destroyed Hollywood's biggest star, and the choice that could cost him everything." Harrison Ford's fingers hovered over the deadbolt, 30 years of muscle memory warring with 3 decades of careful isolation. The metal felt cold against his weathered skin. Everything in Wyoming stayed cold, even in March, even with the wood stove crackling behind him like a heartbeat. He didn't turn the lock. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back and really looked at his sanctuary for what might be the last time. The cabin had taken him 3 years to build, every board cut and fitted by hand. No contractors, no crew, no one who might recognize the face that had once graced movie posters worldwide. Just Harrison Ford and the wilderness, and the kind of honest work that didn't require him to pretend to be anyone else. The main room stretched before him in golden lamplight, rough-hewn beams overhead, furniture he'd crafted during the longest winter nights when sleep wouldn't come. A dining table made from a single piece of Wyoming oak, its grain flowing like water frozen in time. Bookshelves lined with volumes on carpentry, forestry, local history. Nothing about Hollywood. Nothing about the man he used to be. On the mantel above the stone fireplace sat his only concession to the past, a small framed photograph of his daughter when she was 7, gap-toothed and laughing, taken during their last Christmas together before everything fell apart, before the 5 words that had ended more than just his career. "She deserved better than you." The voice in his head sounded like his ex-wife, though Sarah had been kinder when she'd actually said those words. She'd waited until the divorce was final, until the custody arrangements were signed, until she was sure their daughter would be safely removed from the wreckage of his reputation. "Mr. Ford?" Elena's voice carried through the door again, gentler now but no less determined. "I know this is difficult. I know you've built a life here." Through the front window, Ford could see her equipment cases stacked in the snow beside a rented SUV with Colorado plates. Professional gear, the kind documentary filmmakers used when they meant business, the kind that could broadcast the truth to the world if she chose. His hands found the familiar comfort of the workshop knife in his pocket, its handle worn smooth by decades of use. Danny Vasquez had carried a similar tool. All the stunt crews did, for cutting rope and adjusting harnesses and 100 other tasks that kept performers alive. Ford wondered if Danny had been holding his when he fell, if he'd understood in those last seconds that someone wanted him dead. The wind picked up outside, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow devils spinning across the clearing he'd carved from virgin forest. In the morning, if the weather held, he'd planned to start work on a commissioned bookshelf for the family in town who'd become the closest thing he had to friends. The Hendersons didn't know his real name. To them, he was just Harry, the reclusive craftsman who'd appeared in their valley one winter and never left. Tom Henderson was the local sheriff, a decent man who'd never pressed for details about Harry's past or questioned why someone with obvious money chose to live so simply. His wife Martha brought Ford's soup when he was sick, vegetables from her garden in summer, birthday cakes he pretended not to need. Their twin boys, now teenagers, had grown up thinking of him as an honorary grandfather. They called him Grandpa Harry. It was the closest thing to family he'd had in 30 years. If Elena Vasquez released her evidence, if the truth about Danny's death came out along with Ford's real identity, the Hendersons would learn that their trusted friend was a coward who'd let a good man die to save his own reputation. Worse, they'd become targets themselves, reporters camping in their driveway, their quiet lives destroyed by association. Ford moved to the kitchen window that faced the back of his property. Beyond the woodshed and the generator housing, pine trees climbed toward peaks that caught the last of the sunset in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere up there, along the ridge trail he hiked every morning, was the spot where he'd scattered the ashes of Rex, his dog, for 15 years. The only witness to the nightmares, the only one who'd seen him wake up screaming Danny's name. Rex had died last autumn, peacefully in his sleep by the fireplace. Ford had buried him with a collar that bore the name Harry's dog. Not Harrison Ford's dog, never that. Even the veterinarian's records listed the owner as H. Carpenter. "I brought coffee," Elena called out, and Ford heard the rustle of thermos cups. "And I brought something else. Something I think you need to see." The wind gusted again, and for a moment Ford thought he heard another voice in it. Danny's laugh, the way it had sounded that last morning on set when he joked about getting too old for high falls. Danny had been 43, father to a 10-year-old girl who'd believed her daddy was invincible. Ford's reflection stared back from the dark window glass. 82 years old, beard gone white, hands scarred by honest work and dishonest choices. Behind him, the cabin's warmth waited. Ahead, through the front door, lay everything he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. His fingers closed around the deadbolt and turned. The lock clicked open with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Ford's hand remained on the deadbolt as cold air rushed through the widening gap, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, expensive perfume that didn't belong in his wilderness sanctuary. Elena Vasquez stepped inside without invitation, stamping snow from boots that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Up close, the resemblance to her father was unmistakable, the same dark eyes that had looked at Ford with trust, right up until the moment Danny hit the stage floor. She was older than Ford had expected, maybe 40 now, with the kind of composed intensity that came from years of hunting dangerous prey. "Thank you," she said, setting down her equipment case and unscrewing the top of a thermos. Steam rose in the cabin's warmth. "I wasn't sure you'd—" "You look like him." Ford's voice came out rougher than he'd intended, 30 years of careful silence cracking like ice over deep water. "Danny, you have his eyes." Elena paused in pouring the coffee, her hand steady despite the tremor Ford caught at the corner of her mouth. "People used to say that. When I was little, before I understood what it meant." She reached into her jacket and withdrew a manila envelope, its edges worn from handling. Ford's chest tightened as she placed it on his handmade dining table, the one he'd built during his 3rd winter here, when the nightmares had been particularly bad and he'd needed something to occupy his hands at 3 in the morning. "This is a copy," Elena said. "The original is in a safety deposit box in Denver, along with instructions for my lawyer if something happens to me." Her smile held no warmth. "I learned early not to trust Hollywood's definition of accident." Ford made no move toward the envelope. "How did you find me?" "Property records. Harry Carpenter bought this land with cash in 1994, 6 months after Harrison Ford's last public appearance." Elena settled into the chair across from him, uninvited but somehow belonging in his space in a way that made Ford's skin crawl. The seller remembered the buyer, said he seemed familiar but couldn't place the face, especially with the beard. "That's not proof of anything." "No, but this is." Elena opened the envelope and withdrew a photograph, grainy, black and white, the kind taken by long-range surveillance equipment. It showed Ford walking into a Denver bank 15 years ago, his face partially visible beneath a baseball cap. ATM security camera. "You were making a deposit to Harold Carpenter's account. Facial recognition software has come a long way since 1994, Mr. Ford. Even with 30 years of aging, the bone structure doesn't lie." Ford's workshop knife felt heavy in his pocket. He'd killed men before, not in real life, but so many times on camera that the muscle memory lingered. Elena seemed to sense his thoughts because she leaned back slightly, her hand moving closer to her phone. "I'm not here to blackmail you," she said, "and I'm not wearing a wire. This conversation is between us. Then what do you want?" Elena reached into the envelope again and withdrew something that made Ford's blood freeze. A piece of climbing harness, black nylon webbing with precise cuts along the stress points. Even after 30 years, he recognized the distinctive pattern of Danny's personal gear. The official investigation concluded that Dad's harness failed due to wear and manufacturing defects, Elena said, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "But harnesses don't fail like this naturally. These cuts were made with a sharp blade, probably a rigging knife. Someone sabotaged this equipment and watched my father fall to his death." Ford couldn't look away from the frayed webbing. He'd seen Danny checking that harness just hours before the fatal stunt, running his hands along every inch of material with the thoroughness of a man who'd trusted his life to such equipment 1,000 times before. "The police report was filed and forgotten within a week," Elena continued. "No follow-up investigation, no interviews with witnesses beyond the initial statements, just a quick ruling of accidental death and a very generous settlement check for the widow and daughter. Your mother took the money. My mother was 28 years old with a 10-year-old daughter and no other income. Of course she took the money." Elena's composure cracked slightly, revealing the anger beneath. "But I grew up, Mr. Ford. I became the kind of journalist who asks uncomfortable questions, and I found the real police file." She withdrew another document, photocopied pages with large sections blacked out by redaction markers. Turns out there was a second investigation. Federal level. The FBI was already watching several studio executives for possible connections to organized crime money laundering. Dad's death shut down that investigation permanently. Ford's cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in like the sides of a closing trap. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and Elena's rental car sat in his driveway like evidence of a crime scene. "What were those 5 words, Mr. Ford?" Elena asked quietly. "The ones that ended your career? Because I think I already know." Ford's hands shook as he reached for the coffee Elena had poured, the liquid sloshing against the rim of his own ceramic mug, one he'd thrown on the pottery wheel during his 10th year in exile, back when his fingers still trembled from withdrawal. Not from drugs or alcohol, but from the adrenaline addiction of being Harrison Ford, movie star, beloved icon, carefully constructed lie. "You don't know anything," he said. But the words came out hollow even to his own ears. Elena spread the police documents across his dining table with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this before. "I know you gave an interview to Entertainment Tonight 3 days after the funeral. I know you told them, quote, Danny screwed up badly. 5 words that blamed a dead man for his own murder." The coffee turned to ash in Ford's mouth. He'd spoken those words to save himself, to distance Harrison Ford from the investigation before it could touch his career. The studio publicists had coached him. Keep it simple, show appropriate sadness, but make it clear that Ford himself bore no responsibility for what happened. Danny screwed up badly. "The interview aired nationwide," Elena continued, her voice gaining momentum like a prosecutor closing in for the kill. Suddenly, nobody wanted to talk about faulty equipment or safety protocols. The story became about a veteran stuntman who'd gotten careless, who'd cut corners and paid the ultimate price. My father's reputation was destroyed overnight. Ford set down his mug with forced steadiness. "I said what I believed at the time." "Did you?" Elena's dark eyes, Danny's eyes, bored into him. "Because according to the call logs I mentioned, you'd been trying to reach the stunt coordinator all morning. You'd been trying to reach someone, anyone, to voice concerns about that day's setup. That doesn't sound like a man who thought the stuntman was being careless." The walls of Ford's sanctuary pressed closer. Through the kitchen window, he could see the yellow glow from the Henderson place 1/2 mile down the valley. Tom would be helping the boys with homework, while Martha finished the dinner dishes. A normal family living normal lives, untouched by the kind of poison that Elena Vasquez had carried across 3 states to his door. "You want me to say I lied," Ford said. "Fine, I lied. Your father was the most careful stuntman I ever worked with. He checked everything twice. Trusted nobody's work but his own. There's no way Danny screwed up that harness. Then why did you say he did? Ford stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor he'd installed plank by plank. He moved to the fireplace, where the photograph of his daughter watched him with 7-year-old eyes full of trust he'd never deserved. Because I was a coward, he said to the flames. Because I had 3 more pictures in my contract and a divorce lawyer who was already sniffing around my finances. Because Harold Kellerman called my trailer 20 minutes before the entertainment tonight interview and reminded me that Harrison Ford had a brand to protect. Elena's reflection appeared in the dark window glass beside his. Kellerman, the studio head, the man who built half of modern Hollywood, the man who could destroy careers with a phone call and create legends with a handshake. Ford turned to face her. He didn't ask me to blame your father. He suggested it, very gently, very reasonably, said it would be better for everyone if the story stayed simple. What did he offer you? First dollar gross on the next 3 films, director approval, script approval, everything I'd been fighting for during 5 years of contract negotiations. Ford's laugh came out bitter. All I had to do was throw a dead man under the bus. Elena moved closer, and Ford caught the scent of her perfume again, something expensive and predatory. But you didn't get those 3 films, did you? Your career ended anyway. This was the part Ford had never told anyone, not the therapists or the lawyers or the federal investigators who'd questioned him 6 months later when the Meridian Development scandal finally broke. The part that had driven him into the Wyoming wilderness with nothing but guilt and a pickup truck full of carpentry tools. 2 weeks after the interview, I got drunk and called Kellerman. 3 in the morning, California time. I told him I'd changed my mind, that I was going to recant my statement and tell the truth about what I'd overheard in the rigging bay that morning. Elena's breath caught. What did you overhear? Harold Kellerman and Victor Marchetti discussing how to eliminate a problem. How to make sure Danny Vasquez never testified before the federal grand jury investigating Meridian Development. Ford met her eyes. Your father wasn't killed for discovering union kickbacks, Elena. He was killed because he'd agreed to wear a wire to a meeting with studio executives. The FBI had flipped him. The confession hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows of the life Ford had built on silence. Elena's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. What did Kellerman say when you called him? Ford smiled without humor. He hung up. And 3 hours later, every studio in Hollywood received an anonymous package containing photographs of Harrison Ford in some very compromising situations. Pictures that would have destroyed more than just my career if they'd gone public. Blackmail. Insurance. Kellerman had been collecting leverage on his biggest stars for years. I was finished whether I talked or not. Ford moved back to his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 82 years. So I ran, disappeared, let the world think Harrison Ford had simply lost his nerve and walked away from Hollywood. Elena gathered the documents from the table, her movements sharp and efficient. But you didn't walk away, Mr. Ford. You just found a different kind of hiding place. She was right, and they both knew it. The carpentry, the isolation, the carefully constructed identity of Harry Carpenter, all of it had been just another performance, another role to play while the real Harrison Ford rotted away inside like wood infected with termites. The question now, Elena said, zipping up her equipment case, is whether you're finally ready to stop hiding. Ford stared at the closed zipper of Elena's equipment case, watching his reflection fragment across its black surface. The question hung between them like a blade suspended by rotting thread. Whether you're finally ready to stop hiding? You think it's that simple. His voice came out hoarse. 30 years of silence, and you walk in here with your father's eyes and expect me to just, hold a press conference? Write a tell-all book? Elena's hand stilled on the case handle. I expect you to tell the truth. The truth. Ford laughed, but the sound held no humor. The truth is that your father died because I was too much of a coward to speak up when it mattered. The truth is that I've spent 3 decades building furniture and pretending I'm not a murderer. You didn't kill him. I might as well have. Ford moved to the window facing the Henderson place, where the porch light had just clicked on. Tom would be letting their old collie out for his evening run. You know what I did the night after Et Entertainment Tonight interview aired? I went to the premiere of Reckless Dawn, smiled for the cameras, signed autographs, told reporters I was looking forward to getting back to work. Elena's reflection appeared beside his in the glass. You were protecting yourself. I was protecting a lie. Ford's breath fogged the window. Harrison Ford, American hero. Harrison Ford, the guy who always does the right thing. Do you know how many fan letters I got after that interview? Thousands. People telling me how brave I was to tell the truth about Danny, how refreshing it was to see a star who wouldn't cover up for Hollywood's mistakes. The memory tasted like poison. He'd kept those letters, every single one, until the day he'd finally burned them in a bonfire behind this very cabin. The smoke had taken 3 days to clear from the valley. Kellerman knew exactly what he was doing, Ford continued. He didn't just want me to discredit Danny's testimony. He wanted me to become complicit, to make myself an accessory after the fact so I could never betray him without destroying myself. Elena moved closer, and Ford could feel the heat of her anger like radiation from a furnace. But you were going to betray him anyway. When you called him drunk. A moment of conscience that lasted exactly as long as it took for those photographs to surface. Ford turned from the window. You want to know what was in those pictures? Me at a private party in Malibu, 1993. A party hosted by certain studio executives for certain influential politicians. A party where a lot of very illegal deals were discussed. You were there willingly? I was there because Kellerman told me it was good for my career. I was there because I was young and stupid and thought I was untouchable. Ford's hands clenched into fists. I didn't participate in anything illegal, but the photos made it look like I had. They made it look like Harrison Ford was neck deep in the same corruption that killed your father. Elena sank back into her chair, the first crack in her composure Ford had seen. So when you threatened to talk, Kellerman had leverage, perfect career-destroying, reputation-annihilating leverage. Ford moved to his liquor cabinet, a piece he'd built during his 15th winter when the arthritis had started settling into his joints like old regrets. He pulled out a bottle of bourbon, Wyoming-made, nothing like the expensive scotch Harrison Ford used to drink. He didn't have to threaten me directly, just reminded me that certain people had certain photographs, and wouldn't it be a shame if they ended up in the wrong hands? But you left anyway. I ran anyway. Ford poured 2 glasses, offering one to Elena. She shook her head. Took every liquid asset I could access without triggering IRS flags and disappeared. Thought maybe if I vanished completely, the heat would die down. Maybe someday I could come back and set the record straight. What changed? Ford drained his glass in one burning swallow. Time. Every year that passed made the truth harder to tell. Every winter in this cabin, every bookshelf I built, every time Tom Henderson called me his friend, it all became another weight holding me down. And then Danny's case got officially closed. Kellerman died of a heart attack in 2003. Marchetti went to prison for tax evasion but never talked. The other witnesses disappeared or died or decided they'd never seen anything suspicious. Elena leaned forward. Not all of them. The words hit Ford like a physical blow. What do you mean? Marcus Webb, the gaffer who was working the night shift when my father's harness was sabotaged. He's still alive, still remembers seeing someone in the rigging bay who shouldn't have been there. Elena's smile was sharp as broken glass. He's been waiting 30 years for someone to ask him the right questions. Ford's bourbon glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. Ford stared at the amber liquid spreading across the hardwood, watching his reflection shatter and reform in the fractured pool. The sound of breaking glass seemed to echo in the sudden silence, punctuated only by the wind rattling his windows like skeletal fingers against a coffin lid. Webb is alive, he said, the words coming out flat and hollow. It wasn't a question. Elena nodded, her dark eyes never leaving his face. Very much alive. Retired now, living in Tucson. I found him 3 months ago. Ford's knees buckled, and he gripped the edge of his dining table for support. Marcus Webb, the quiet, methodical gaffer who'd been working the studio night shift for 20 years, who'd seen everything and said nothing. Ford had assumed Webb was dead or bought off or scared into permanent silence like everyone else who'd been on set that night. "What did he tell you?" Ford asked. "He told me about the man he saw in the rigging bay at 2:17 a.m. Elena reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a small digital recorder. "He told me about watching this person cut through my father's harness with what looked like a professional rigger's knife. He told me about following the saboteur to the parking garage afterward." Ford's workshop began to spin around him. 30 years of carefully constructed assumptions were crumbling like termite-damaged wood. Following him where? To Harold Kellerman's private car. Elena's finger hovered over the recorder's play button. Webb got the license plate number. He also had a camera. The world stopped. Ford's breathing stopped. Even his heartbeat seemed to pause as the implications crashed over him like a collapsing building. Webb photographed the saboteur. Crystal clear shots. The man's face, the license plate, even the rigger's knife in his hand. Elena's smile was arctic. Turns out Webb had been documenting safety violations on studio sets for years, building his own insurance policy against corporate retaliation. He just never knew what to do with this particular evidence. Ford stumbled backward until his spine hit the fireplace mantel. The photograph of his daughter gazed down at him with innocent eyes, and he suddenly understood why Elena had been studying it so intently earlier. She knew. Somehow, impossibly, she knew everything. "Who was it?" he whispered. Elena pressed play on the recorder. Marcus Webb's weathered voice filled the cabin, distorted by 3 decades but still clear enough to understand every damning word. "The man I saw cutting through Danny Vasquez's harness was approximately 6 feet tall, brown hair, wearing dark clothing. I followed him to the parking garage where he met with Harold Kellerman beside a black Mercedes sedan, license plate." Webb's voice rattled off a number that Ford recognized from his nightmares. "I took photographs of the entire exchange." The saboteur handed Kellerman the rigger's knife, and Kellerman gave him what appeared to be a briefcase. They spoke for perhaps 5 minutes before separating. Elena stopped the recording. Webb says he tried to reach the police the next morning, but his calls were never returned. When he attempted to contact the FBI, he was told the case was closed, and further interference would result in federal obstruction charges. Ford's legs gave out completely. He slid down the stone fireplace until he was sitting on his own floor, surrounded by splinters of bourbon glass that caught the lamplight like fallen stars. The saboteur. Webb saw his face. He saw his face. He photographed his face. Elena knelt beside Ford, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Would you like to know what name was on the Mercedes registration?" Ford closed his eyes, but he could still see Elena's predatory smile burning against his eyelids. "Tell me." The car belonged to Kellerman's personal assistant, a man named David Chen, who'd been handling the studio head's private business for 8 years. Elena paused, letting the information sink in like poison into wood grain. The same David Chen who was found dead in his apartment 6 months later, apparent suicide, just 3 days before he was scheduled to testify before the federal grand jury investigating Meridian Development. The revelation hit Ford like a physical blow to the chest. Chen, quiet, efficient David Chen, who'd brought coffee to meetings and scheduled appointments and murdered Danny Vasquez on Harold Kellerman's orders before being silenced permanently when he became a liability. "Webb has been carrying this knowledge for 30 years, Elena continued. "Watching my father get blamed for his own murder, watching you walk away from Hollywood without consequences, watching the real killers die of natural causes while their victim's reputation remained destroyed." Ford opened his eyes and met Elena's gaze. In those dark depths, he finally understood what he was truly facing. This wasn't about justice or truth or redemption. This was about the specific kind of fury that could only be born from 3 decades of perfectly preserved grief. "You're not making a documentary," he said. Elena's smile turned predatory. "Oh, but I am, Mr. Ford. I'm making the most important documentary of your career." She leaned closer, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of accumulated rage, the one that's going to destroy every lie you've ever told. Ford watched Elena pocket the recorder with movements sharp as a scalpel, each gesture calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage. The broken bourbon glass crunched under his weight as he shifted against the stone fireplace, and he could feel dampness seeping through his jeans. Whether from spilled liquor or his own sweat, he couldn't tell. "Webb's testimony won't be enough," he said finally. 30-year-old photographs the word of a man who stayed silent when it mattered. Any decent lawyer will tear it apart. "You're right." Elena stood, towering over him with the recorder gleaming in her palm like a weapon. "That's why I need your confession. On camera. In your own words." Harrison Ford finally admitting he lied to protect murderers. The cabin felt impossibly small now, the walls pressing inward like a coffin built from his own handiwork. Ford's gaze drifted to the kitchen window, where Tom Henderson's porch light still glowed warm and yellow in the darkness. How many times had Tom invited him for Sunday dinner? How many times had Martha Henderson sent over fresh-baked bread with her youngest boy, treating the hermit Carpenter like family? "And if I refuse?" Elena's laugh was crystalline, beautiful, and completely devoid of warmth. "Then I release everything anyway. Webb's testimony, Chen's photographs, the financial records I've spent 2 years accumulating. But without your cooperation, the narrative becomes much simpler. Harrison Ford, coward and conspirator, who let an innocent man take the blame for his own murder." She moved to the window overlooking the valley, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. "With your confession, there's a chance for something resembling redemption. The grieving widower who finally finds the courage to tell the truth. The fallen star seeking atonement for his sins. Redemption." Ford tasted the word like communion wine turned to vinegar. "Is that what you think this is about?" "I think this is about my father dying alone in a hospital bed while newspapers called him a careless drunk. I think this is about my mother working 3 jobs to keep us fed while Hollywood executives toasted another successful cover-up." Elena's voice cracked for the first time since she'd entered his sanctuary. "I think this is about justice being delayed for 30 fucking years." Ford struggled to his feet, glass fragments falling from his jeans like crystallized regret. His hands found the mantelpiece, fingers tracing the rough stone he'd mortared himself during his 3rd winter in exile. Everything in this cabin was built by his own hands. Floors, cabinets, the very walls that had sheltered his cowardice for 3 decades. "Justice," he repeated. "You want to destroy me in the name of justice. I want to destroy the lie that's been protecting murderers while my father's reputation rotted in the ground." Elena turned from the window, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like obsidian. "Your destruction is just a pleasant side effect." The honesty was almost refreshing. Ford had spent so many years surrounded by careful politeness. Tom Henderson's respectful distance, Martha's gentle concern, the studied indifference of Jackson shopkeepers who treated Harry Carpenter like any other aging tradesman. Elena's hatred was pure and clean as mountain air. "You've thought this through," Ford said. "Every angle, every consequence. You know what happens to an 82-year-old man when this story breaks." "I know what happened to a 43-year-old woman when her husband's reputation was destroyed," Elena countered. "I know what happened to his children when they had to change schools because other kids called their father a murderer." Ford closed his eyes and saw Danny Vasquez as he'd been that last morning, checking rigging points with obsessive care, double-testing safety harnesses, treating his stunt work with the precision of a surgeon. Danny, who'd never missed a safety briefing, who'd insisted on personally inspecting every piece of equipment that might keep him alive. Danny, who'd been an FBI informant, wearing a wire to gather evidence against the studio executives who'd been skimming union funds and laundering money through shell companies. Danny, who died not for discovering corruption, but for agreeing to testify about it. "The 5 words," Ford said suddenly. Elena tilted her head. "What?" "The 5 words that ended my career. You've been building toward asking me what they were. What I actually said in that drunken phone call to Kellerman." Ford opened his eyes and met her gaze. "You want to know what finally convinced him I had to be silenced permanently?" For the first time since entering his cabin, Elena looked uncertain. "What did you say?" Ford moved to his bourbon cabinet and withdrew another bottle, this one older, more expensive, a gift from Tom Henderson last Christmas that he'd been saving for a special occasion. His hands didn't shake as he poured 2 glasses. "I said, I know who killed Danny." Ford offered Elena the second glass, and this time she accepted it. 5 words that told Kellerman I'd figured out Chen was more than just a messenger. 5 words that signed my own exile warrant. Elena stared into the amber liquid. But you never told anyone else. Until now. Ford raised his glass in a mock toast. Congratulations, Elena. You finally found someone who wants the truth told even more than you do. Elena stared at Ford, searching his weathered face for deception, for the careful actor's mask he'd worn for 30 years. Instead, she found something that made her hand tremble around the crystal tumbler. Absolute, devastating sincerity. You're lying, she whispered, but the words carried no conviction. Ford drained his glass in a single swallow, the burn of alcohol nothing compared to the fire that had been consuming him for 3 decades. I've been lying for 30 years, Elena. I'm done. The confession hit her like a physical blow. She'd spent months preparing for his denials, his justifications, his desperate attempts to minimize his role in the conspiracy. She'd never prepared for surrender. This is another manipulation, Elena said, backing toward the door. Another performance. Harrison Ford playing the repentant sinner. Harrison Ford died in this cabin 15 years ago, Ford replied quietly. I buried him the same winter I built that bookshelf. He gestured toward the oak shelving that dominated the far wall, every joint perfectly fitted, every surface hand-sanded to silk smoothness. You're talking to Harry Carpenter now. And Harry Carpenter is tired of carrying Harrison Ford's sins. Elena's carefully constructed facade began to crack. For months, she'd sustained herself on righteous fury, on the crystalline purity of her mission. Now Ford was offering her everything she'd demanded, and she felt nothing but hollow confusion. Webb's testimony will corroborate everything I'm about to tell you, Ford interrupted. He moved to the dining table where his laptop sat closed among scattered woodworking sketches. His fingers traced the machine's silver surface. I haven't touched this in 2 years. Tom Henderson's grandson set it up, said I might want to stay connected to the world. The laptop opened with a soft electronic hum. Ford's hands, which moved with such confidence over wood and metal, fumbled awkwardly with the keyboard. The screen's glow painted his face in harsh white light, revealing every line carved by guilt and isolation. What are you doing? Elena asked. What I should have done 30 years ago. Ford found the webcam application, his reflection appearing in a small window, an old man with wild gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. I'm going to record my confession. Everything. Danny's murder, Chen's role, Kellerman's conspiracy, the corruption that reached from studio boardrooms to federal judges. Elena dropped into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. You can't. The moment I release that, Harrison Ford becomes the biggest criminal in Hollywood history, Ford agreed. Every film he made, every award he won, every dollar he earned, all of it built on a murdered man's grave. His finger hovered over the record button. In the laptop's reflection, Elena could see her own face, pale and stricken. She looked exactly like her mother had the day the death certificate arrived, when hope finally died and left only grief behind. My father's reputation, she said weakly, will be completely restored. Danny Vasquez, hero, FBI informant who died fighting corruption, family man who sacrificed everything to expose the truth. Ford's voice grew stronger with each word. That's the story the world will remember. Elena's glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood in an echo of Ford's earlier destruction. But you'll be destroyed, your family, your legacy. My family disowned me 20 years ago when I stopped returning their calls. My legacy is built on lies and dead men's bones. Ford met her eyes through the laptop screen. Your legacy is what matters now. Danny's daughter, the filmmaker who brought down Hollywood's greatest conspiracy. The weight of 30 years pressed down on the cabin's silence. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees with the sound of whispered secrets finally ready to be told. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and irregular, keeping time with revelations that were reshaping everything she thought she knew about justice and revenge. Why now? She asked. Why are you willing to confess to me when you stayed silent all these years? Ford's reflection smiled sadly in the laptop screen. Because you gave me something I never had before, a witness who won't be bought, threatened, or silenced. Someone who wants the truth more than they want to protect themselves. His finger moved toward the record button with the steady inevitability of an avalanche, because Harry Carpenter learned something Harrison Ford never understood. Redemption isn't about saving yourself, it's about saving the truth. Elena watched her 30-year quest for vengeance transform into something larger and more terrible, a reckoning that would shake Hollywood to its foundations and destroy the last comfortable lies of a generation. "Wait," she whispered. But Ford had already pressed record. The red light began to blink like a heartbeat, like a countdown, like the last seconds of Harrison Ford's carefully constructed world. The red recording light pulsed in the cabin's silence like a digital heartbeat counting down to Judgment Day. Ford stared into the laptop's camera lens, his reflection fractured between the man he'd been and the truth he was about to unleash. "My name is Harrison Ford," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of silence. "And I need to tell you about the night Danny Vasquez was murdered." Elena watched from across the room, her body rigid with a mixture of anticipation and dread she couldn't name. This moment, the moment she'd orchestrated, fought for, sacrificed years of her life to achieve, felt nothing like the triumphant vindication she'd imagined. Instead, it felt like watching a man commit suicide in real time. Ford spoke for 43 minutes without stopping. He detailed every meeting with Kellerman, every phone call, every moment of cowardice that had allowed murderers to walk free while Danny's reputation burned. His voice never wavered, never sought sympathy or understanding. He simply told the truth with the methodical precision of a carpenter measuring wood. Each fact cut to exact specifications, each revelation fitted perfectly into the larger structure of his confession. When he finally stopped speaking, the cabin felt hollow, evacuated of something essential. Ford closed the laptop with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid settling into place. "It's done," he said. Elena found herself unable to speak. The fury that had sustained her for so long was gone, leaving behind something she didn't recognize. Not satisfaction, not peace, but a strange, echoing emptiness where her rage used to live. "What happens now?" she asked. Ford stood and moved to the kitchen window. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Teton Range, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose. He'd watched this same sunrise for 22 years, but somehow it looked different now, cleaner, maybe, less burdened by shadow. "Now you take that recording and show the world who your father really was," Ford said, "and I wait for the consequences." Elena joined him at the window. In the growing light, she could see the valley spread out below. Neat farmhouses, grazing cattle, ordinary people beginning ordinary days. People who would wake up tomorrow to learn that Harrison Ford was a monster and Danny Vasquez was a hero. "You'll be arrested," she said quietly. "Probably. Your life here, everything you've built, was built on a lie anyway." Ford's reflections smiled sadly in the glass. "At least now it'll be an honest ruin." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the sun climb higher above the mountains. Elena found herself thinking of her mother, who died 5 years ago, still believing the world had forgotten Danny Vasquez. Maria would never see her husband's vindication, never know that justice had finally arrived on arthritic legs and speaking with the voice of her greatest enemy. "I hated you," Elena said suddenly. "I know. For 30 years, I hated you more than anything else in the world. I used to fall asleep imagining what I'd do to you if I ever got the chance." Ford nodded. "What did you imagine?" Elena considered the question seriously. "Pain, humiliation. I wanted you to lose everything the way we lost everything. I wanted you to know what it felt like to have your name become a curse. And now?" Elena studied Ford's profile in the morning light. The deep lines around his eyes, the silver stubble, the way his shoulders curved inward as if he'd been carrying invisible weight for decades. He looked exactly like what he was, an old man who'd spent most of his life running from a moment of truth he should have embraced at 28. "Now I think you've been punishing yourself better than I ever could," she said. Ford's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Harry Carpenter's been a prison guard for 30 years. Turns out he was very good at his job." Elena picked up her camera equipment, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone completing a long-delayed task. The recording would be uploaded within hours, sent simultaneously to major news outlets, documentary festivals, and social media platforms. By evening, Harrison Ford's confession would be spreading across the internet like wildfire, impossible to contain or control. "For what it's worth," she said, pausing at the cabin door, "my father would have forgiven you. He wasn't built for holding grudges." Ford remained at the window, watching the last shadows retreat from the valley floor. "Then he was a better man than both of us." Elena stepped onto the porch, breathing mountain air that tasted like pine needles and possibility. Behind her, she could hear Ford moving through his cabin, the soft sound of footsteps on hand-laid hardwood, the creak of handmade furniture, the quiet domestic symphony of a man beginning what might be his last ordinary day. 30 years of hatred was over. Justice, delayed but not denied, was finally at hand, and somehow, Elena Vasquez felt more lost than she had since her father died.